for the 3 breakout rooms that we have, because that's where you'll be able to have a more intimate environment, for lack of a better word, with those of us who have been working on this project. The 3 breakout rooms will be the types and methods of fuel reduction, hazard modeling, and fuel break design, location, and function. And then a room to talk about the Cal Vegetation Treatment Program environmental review and how we're going to meet the objectives of our environmental review through this. And Tanya or Caitlin, can you discuss how people should ask for questions and the logistics of moving to the rooms and stuff, please?
Yeah, so at the end of the main presentation, we have a slide that'll talk about how to go to the different rooms. And maybe we'll save it for then because it'll be a little closer to when you need to do it. But we'll have it all set up. It's pretty easy. As Mark mentioned, there are 3 breakout rooms. We'll have instructions in each of how to ask questions. So with that, Caitlin, maybe you want to pull up the main presentation and we'll start there.
Thank you. And if I remember right, we were going to have people enter any questions into the chat for the main room, correct? And then when we get to the breakouts, that's where they can either enter in the questions via chat or raise their hand with the virtual hand raising. So again, my name is Mark Brown, and I have the honor of being the Executive Officer for the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. And we are excited about this community meeting tonight. This is we are a new agency, and this is our first large multi-agency project that's requiring a lot of planning amongst its various agencies. And also it's our first opportunity to really interact with the residents in the way that we are interacting tonight. Next slide, please. And so we are going to give a brief update about the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. And I did want to recognize some of the elected officials I see, and I'll apologize if I missed some of you because I keep seeing people pop in the room, and it's a little bit harder for me to scan the room than it used to be. But we have Council Member Gabe Paulson, Council Member Bob Ravazio, and then the president of our board of directors, Bruce Goins, are in the room tonight. So thank you guys for coming. Brief introduction for myself. Besides being the executive officer of the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, I'm the retired deputy fire chief from the Marin County Fire Department, where I served for 30 years. But I've also served on a CAL FIRE incident management team for 15 years as an operations section chief and as an incident commander. And I've seen what fires do. I've seen how fires have changed. I've seen what fires do when they hit areas that we have provided vegetation management treatments. And unfortunately, I've seen what happens when the fires burn through areas that have had no treatment at all. With us tonight also, we have Ann Krelock, our planning and program manager. And Ann, if you can provide a quick introduction, please.
Sure. Thanks for that, Mark. I'm Ann Krelock. I'm the planning and program manager with the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. I have a couple of decades in environmental compliance and biological resources, natural resources management, about a decade in climate adaptation, and the last few years in fire resilience adaptation at the watershed scale or so, and fire recovery, unfortunately. So looking forward to the conversation tonight, looking forward to the breakout rooms where we can have more of a conversation, and looking forward to the rest of the presentation here. Thanks.
Thank you, Ann. And I was able to scan through our list, and I do see Council Member Rachel Kurtz, who's also one of our board members here. So thank you for being here tonight, Rachel. Kentfield Fire District is one of our partner agencies in this project. The Ross Valley Fire Department, and inclusive of the Ross Valley Fire Department is the Town of Ross, Town of San Anselmo, Town of Fairfax, and the Sleepy Hollow Fire Protection District. And then the Marin County Fire Department is also one of our partners. And then I saved Central Marin Fire for last, because Todd Lando is going to be one of our speakers, and I'd like to have Todd have an opportunity to introduce himself, and then we'll move on to our panorama team.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Todd Lando. I'm a wildfire hazard mitigation specialist with Central Marin Fire Department. And really proud to have worked with this team to develop the scope of this project and get this moving to protect our communities.
And Tanya, if you can have you and your team introduce themselves, please.
I'm Tanya Trice. I'm a principal and owner of Panorama Environmental, and we're the environmental consulting firm that's been assisting MWPA with this and many other projects. And I have about 20 years of experience in environmental planning and about 10 years of that in Marin, including working with Marin Municipal Water District on their vegetation management plan. And with me today, I have Emily Capello. Emily, do you want to give a quick intro, and you'll see Emily in one of the breakout rooms?
Thank you. My name is Emily Capello, and I'm supporting Tanya on the project management for this project.
And then we also have Caitlin Gillerin.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm Caitlin Gillerin, and some of you may know me. I've been supporting MWPA throughout several environmental compliance processes, and I'm here supporting the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fieldwork project.
And then we also have, not shown here, but with Panorama, we have Vibrant Planet. So we have Colton and Scott Conway from Vibrant Planet. I'm not sure if they are on, but they will be in one of the breakout rooms, and they were instrumental in helping us design and do some of the modeling that you'll see in this presentation. And then we also have Grace Manel from Sequoia, who is our biologist, and Sequoia is our biological support team. So they've also had a big role in this.
All right, thank you. And next slide, please. So a little bit of a history of the MWPA and a little bit of history of fire in Marin. You know, we have been spared from some of the larger fires that has been hitting across the state, and especially in the Bay Area. We did have the Woodward fire in 2020 of a little over 5,000 acres, but we do have a significant fire history here in Marin. And I always like to emphasize that if you want to predict the future in wildfire, you have to look at the past. But here's the difference. The rate of spread, the fire intensities that we are seeing now is far different than the past. And I like to use the Tubbs fire as an example. In 1964, the Tubbs fire burned virtually the same footprint, but it was called a Hanley fire. It took 2.5 days to fill the amount of space in 1964 as the Tubbs fire did in 6 hours. And the Hanley fire stopped at Highway 101, whereas the Tubbs fire kept on going and went past 101, burned several commercial structures, and as we all know, impacted heavily in Coffey Park. So we can look at Marin fire history, and we look at the fire of 1923. It's the largest fire that you see on that map. If that fire burned like that in 1923, it can burn like that now, and most likely it'll burn much faster, much more intense. So again, like I said, if you want to predict the future, look at the past. Next slide, please. Thank you. And how did the MWPA come about? And it was after an evaluation of the lessons learned from the 2017 fires. We invited the law enforcement, fire, and land management agencies from Sonoma County up down to Marin, and we asked them, what were you all doing before the fire? What did you do during the fire, and what have you been doing after? We asked them what their successes were and what their challenges were. And that created the lessons learned document. And it came up with 6 pages of action items. And what we found was that there's no single agency that was responsible to take care of those action items. Furthermore, there was no funding to take care of all those action items. And then we had the support of the 2019 Marin Civil Grand Jury and their report on wildfire preparedness, a new approach, echoing what we identified in the lessons learned and recommending a JPA that was funded. And something I know that the members of the grand jury are quite proud of. They received an award for this report that they had written. It was so well written. Next slide, please. So the mission of the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority is to lead the development of fire adapted communities using sound scientific, financial, programmatic, ecological practices, vegetation management, community education, and evacuation and warning systems with the support of its member and partner agencies. And on this slide, you see all the people that we have to partner with that in order to make our communities safe. We're all going to have to work at this together. If someone doesn't do their role, then it's going to create weaknesses within our fire resiliency. And we have been working side by side with our land managers And as I look at our attendance, we have 70 members of the public here tonight. So that's awesome that we have engaged Marin residents stepping up and watching what's going on and being part of it. We have our civic leaders, both elected, appointed, and also people who volunteer to be leaders within their communities. And of course, we're working side by side with our first responders in fire prevention and also giving them more access to be able to fight the fires when they're burning. And then we're also partnering with our business and developers so that we can build in fire safe manners. Next slide, please. And here is the list of our goal areas. One of our goals is to reduce wildfire fuels. Another goal is to improve evacuation systems and evacuation routes. We also have to reduce the risk to our homes, whether it's home hardening or defensible space. Public education is vital. And then we also want to help our community members do the work that they need to do, whether it's through grant programs, direct assistance, abatement, or the low-income senior exemptions that we provide. And I really want to emphasize that for us to be successful, we have to follow a systems approach using our house out strategy. And the house out strategy is that we work with our residents to create home hardening, to create that defensible space, so that as a fire approaches and embers start to land in our properties, we can avoid home ignition. And that's the partnership between the MWPA, the fire agencies, and our residents to make that happen. The next piece is hardening our evacuation routes, making sure that when we have people fleeing from fires on their evacuation routes, that they will survive in their vehicles while on that evacuation route. Another component is exactly what we're talking about tonight, and that's a shaded fuel break along the wildland urban interface boundary. That way we can decrease the intensities of the fire as the embers land in and around our community. As the fire approaches our community, the rates of spread decrease, intensities decrease. That gives us more time to get the residents out and for our firefighters to come in and have success. And that last piece is the overall forest health, so that we can keep these intense fires from being created out in the open wildlands that burn with such intensities that it destroys everything. Every plant, every tree that's in that fire footprint is destroyed. And then it encroaches upon our communities with such energy that there's nothing we can do about it. Increasing the forest health will allow us to get to the point where we can have healthy fires again. And next slide for Todd.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the genesis of this project, the purpose, the goals of the project, and introduce, at least in part, how we're going to complete this work. I want to point out that this is one of many projects that have been proposed and funded by the MWPA. This particular piece, in fact, our discussion tonight, comes from what the Ross Valley and Central Marin fire agencies proposed in the 2021 budget year. So last year's budget. This is the largest vegetation management project that's been undertaken by the MWPA or any of our member agencies to date. But it certainly, in all likelihood, is not going to be the largest in the life of this organization. This is just the start. The project itself has a goal of building and maintaining a continuous reduced fuel and forest health restoration zone around all of the communities in Central Marin and the Ross Valley. And that's going to take the form of what we call a shaded fuel break. We'll explain tonight in great detail what that means and how that's created and what the impacts will be to the community and the spaces around your homes, how it might protect the community. But in general, I want to tell you that the years 1 and 2 of the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, remember that this organization was created by during the election in 2020. Those first 2 years are most of our projects, most of the efforts by the member agencies have focused on home hardening, making structures more resilient to embers during wildfires, and focused on defensible space, which is the area, the landscaping around homes on private property that homeowners are in control of, where you're required to maintain vegetation in a way, you're required by law to maintain vegetation in a way that resists wildfires and helps reduce the impact to your home. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind is the lessons we've learned from recent wildfires. Mark Brown mentioned the Tubbs fire, the Camp Fire in 2018 in Paradise was a great example. The Thomas Fire that same year in Southern California. The terrible fires just last year all across Northern California. What we've learned is that each of these fires, each of the catastrophic fires that impacted communities and burned hundreds, sometimes thousands or tens of thousands of homes, they all started in wild areas, wildlands adjacent to communities, but they didn't start within the community itself. They didn't start in the neighborhoods. These were fires that started as wildfires and spread, and sometimes under terrible wind conditions, into the community, striking the community at the edge of the built environment, where they ignited homes, which spread millions and billions of embers into the community, which causes a chain reaction of ignitions of homes. So we recognize that the boundary of the community where those wildfires might reach the first homes is critical. Our year 1 and 2 focus on home hardening and defensible space plays an incredibly important role in preventing that from happening in the community. But we have to do work at the boundary of the community as well. And this is that step. We started at the home, we're working out. You've probably heard us already tonight mention the house out approach, and this is part of that. So the best available science to us tells us that vegetation within 200 feet of homes is the vegetation that's most critical to that home's survival. Based on that science, it's called the home ignition zone research, started in the 1980s or maybe a little earlier. We want to focus on vegetation that starts at the back doors of the homes that are adjacent to the open spaces surrounding our community and work our way out about 200 feet. That's how we came to the conclusion that this particular project was of such great benefit. It's important to remember tonight when you look at this project that about 99% of the fires that happen in and around your community are going to happen under average or moderate weather conditions. They're not going to be under the type of conditions that drove the Camp Fire or the Tubbs fire. That's not to say that's not possible, and it probably will happen at some point. But we're, in addition to trying to protect our communities and provide some safety during the extreme conditions, it's critical that we focus on what we can do to prevent smaller fires under less extreme conditions from doing more damage than they ought to. All of this plays into probably the most important point, and that is that the environment in the forest and the rangelands outside of your homes is not healthy right now. I think it's fair. I'll apologize to all of my colleagues in the fire service, but I think we deserve probably the lion's share of the blame for this. More than 100 years of suppressing every fire that starts in Marin has contributed to fuel conditions and overgrowth in vegetation, trees that are unhealthy, trees with limbs too close to the ground, and an explosion in invasive plants that might have normally been held at check by natural wildfires. When we talk about this project, recognize that we truly feel that the most valuable condition we can restore to the community is the native healthy forest conditions that might have been here 150 years ago or more before the Europeans arrived in Marin. And please keep in mind, I'm going to close out here, that there's no trade-off between the type of work that we're proposing and environmental health. What we need to do is improve the health of the environment, improve the health of the native forests, restore native plant communities, and really focus on that. And by doing that, we'll build a much more resilient, fire-resilient vegetation landscape around our homes. With that, I think we've got a lot of information about the project to present to you.
Thanks, Todd. Next slide. Sorry. So as Todd just mentioned, the purpose of this project is to create this zone of strategic fuel reduction around Central Marin. I think that he made the point very clear of why we're here and what the overlying purpose is. And another objective is that, you know, while the fire agencies are very aware of the landscape and what needs to be done where, part of this project has included taking a scientific approach, using modeling in order to really, confirm those assumptions, and from that to develop a strategic plan addressing what are the highest priorities to treat, and where can the work be done in order to basically get the most bang for the buck to start. And so the other objective of this project is that this is, well, Todd mentioned this is the largest project in the work plan. This is actually the planning stage of the project. Nothing on the ground under this project has been done. Areas of this have been treated in the past, but this effort is a planning project, and a critical part of the process is completing the environmental review to allow for implementation of this project over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, as it will also include maintenance. The project is 38 miles long in total. So the image on the right, the swirly red line, is what this 200 to 300 foot fuel break looks like. And it crosses a lot of different land ownerships. So it crosses private lands, Marin County, City of Larkspur, City of Mill Valley, Town of Fairfax, Town of Ross, Town of Corte Madera, Town of San Anselmo, and Kentfield. And it also crosses public lands, including Marin County Open Space District land and Marin Municipal Water District. But it should be noted that in the small areas that cross MMWD land, those are shown as part of the continuous area. It's really important that this fuel break continues all the way around the communities, but those areas, just keep in mind, are addressed under MMD's existing programs. And that's another important point. This is not being planned or done in any sort of vacuum. There's been tons of communications with partners, with open space, with the district, in order to really coordinate this effort. Next slide. So this, as Todd mentioned, the zone is generally 200 foot wide. That is what the science shows is the important, the width, but it includes a shaded fuel break, but also fuel reduction areas, as not every area is wooded. So we know this is called the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break, but keep in mind, there's definitely variations in there. This is really about the fuel reduction and the forest health. The overall acreage included in this fuel break is 1,379, and treatments have been defined for approximately 1,150 of those acres. As we mentioned, we've looked at up to 300 feet. So these acres show what it would be, the 38 miles times the 300 feet. But keep in mind, we just did that in order to have a larger envelope to work from. In most places, it'll be 200 feet. The fuel work could be less or more. It's just going to depend on conditions. The project also includes some extended areas of vegetation or undeveloped lands, including open spaces or larger undeveloped private lands between that fuel break zone and the communities. And we've identified these as extended areas, and they're being covered under the environmental review. They aren't prioritized at this time, but the idea here was that as the fuel break is being created and treated, opportunities may arise to work on those areas within the communities and the fuel break. And so we want to be able to do that. Those areas comprise another 500 acres. And that's on the map on the left. That's going to be the orange area, are those areas. The types of treatments that will be utilized are predominantly hand methods and really a lot of invasive species removal. So again, given the terrain, the access, the type of work that needs to be done, most of this is going to be done manually by hand. A small amount of mechanical removal was identified, maybe about 20 acres. So as you can see, a very small percentage. The work also will include prescribed herbivory, so goats, sheep, and that may be used as a method of pre-treatment or maintenance or treatment in certain areas, so it could overlap the manual treatments. And some areas have been identified as very steep and treatments were not specifically defined, but depending on actual ground conditions, treatments could occur in those areas. Next slide. So as I mentioned, most of the work would be done by hand crews, and there's a couple different types of manual work. So the mapping for the project identifies the likely treatments. That's shown here on the left. This is the fuel break. Much of this work includes hand crews working from the ground. The different types of manual work included in the light blue is where treatments are consistently and equally applied across the area, and the goal there is to significantly reduce the effects of high fire intensity. Work is also includes pretty extensive broom pulling and invasive species removal. That's shown in the orange areas in this particular little snippet of the field break. Other areas include more variable treatments to mimic conditions that might exist in a natural environment where natural fires were allowed to occur. And I'll talk in a minute how we determine what should be where. And again, this is more of a guide. Actual ground truthing, additional ground truthing would happen to figure out what would be done before the work. As previously mentioned, we looked at areas up to 300 feet, but the focus is on the 200 feet. And within that, the first 100 to 150 feet is typically defensible space prescriptions. And the zone from around 150 to 200 or plus includes lower intensity work, so focused primarily on removal of invasive and non-native species, fire hazard vegetation, removal of dead and dying vegetation, and limbing of native trees. An important part of the process is prior to conducting the work each year, the areas to be treated will be visited on the ground and the level of work will be fine-tuned to the specific areas. So this is, a bit of a high level analysis at this point. There's definitely, before the work is done, there is more fine-tuning to figure out what exactly can be and has to be done where. Some areas have also already been treated and they may need less work or no work. Other areas may need more work. Some areas are steep, as we mentioned, and difficult to access. So, but when those are visited, it's possible that something could be done there. And then important to note, the program also includes maintenance over time. Next slide. So I'd like to give you just a little background on how we define the field break and the treatments that I just described. We used a modeling approach, as I mentioned earlier on, with the help of the forest ecologists from Vibrant Planet. And we do have one breakout room, room 2, that will go into more detail on the modeling and how the field break was designed. But I'll provide you a really high overview just now, right now. When we first started the project, we had a draft field break location from Todd and his group. And the first step was to realign that draft field break with aerial imagery and other data to match the building footprints. So really to get the location as accurate as we could to be that 200 feet from structures. The next step was then to divide that long field break into different segments or polygons that presented a potential forest health treatment unit. So just segregating these into little different units by vegetation and field conditions. So the segments were developed using spatial data, including the Marin County fuel model, the LiDAR-derived fine-scale data, surface fuel model, fire modeling, parcel level risk assessment, and field visits. And then the segments were developed and the field break was divided into 800 different segments. Then a rule set was developed that assigned vegetation treatments suitable to those different conditions. And those related to ownership, slope, vegetation characteristics, and other attributes from those segments. And then the impacts of treatment, those prescribed treatments on fire behavior were assessed to understand the efficacy of the treatment. So what were the hazards and fire behavior before and after the treatment? And primary and secondary treatments were then assigned with costs and some field verification was done. And finally, the treatments were prioritized based on where the most improvement in fire behavior could be seen for the work effort undertaken. And it's a little more complicated than that. Colton can talk a little more about it, but that's sort of the high level. The segments were grouped into logical successive areas. You didn't want to have 800 little patches to treat. And so essentially there's linear segments of this, and so that it can be more easily implemented. So the next slide. So this slide shows the results of the prioritization. So up in here, you can see near the north part is near Loma Alta is where the first priority area is shown, and then second, third, etc. And you should remember that this is also just a guide. It's not set in stone. Some areas may present opportunities to treat sooner, even if a lower priority, and obviously those opportunities would be taken. Some areas may already have treatment, that are shown here or under different programs or grants. The idea here is more to present a logical path to follow or guide. Next slide. So the next few slides show what field treatments can look like on the landscape. We know that it can be kind of hard to visualize what the change is, and often when we describe what this work is in writing or environmental documents, it can sound a little different than maybe what it actually looks like. And so we thought it would be good to have some slides to show before and after pictures. And I'm actually going to invite Todd to jump back on for a second and walk you guys through these slides, as these are all areas in Marin.
Yeah, so this is an image, this is actually within the boundary of the proposed shaded fuel break. This is the Citron Bowl on the King Mountain Open Space Preserve, just outside of downtown Larkspur. This was an area that we've been battling for at least more than a decade, probably closer to 20 years, an invasion of acacia and broom. White acacia species. They both, the broom and the acacia, have created fire hazardous conditions. This is what you see right here is a result after 1 year of the type of treatment activity that we're talking about. We in this case, we cut and removed the acacia. We did some pile burning, some very low intensity burning of piles to put some of those nutrients back into the ground. From the parks, and applied a very small amount of herbicide to help with the regrowth of acacia. What we've done is restored a much healthier version of the native oak woodland.
Oh. Sorry, Todd, I think we've lost your connection a little bit. I'll give you a second, otherwise we can maybe move on to the next one.
But my apologies. Can you hear me now?
We got you.
Okay. So, sorry about that. So I don't know what you heard, but this was a very low intensity acacia and French broom treatment on more than 20 acres in county parklands right adjacent to the town of Larkspur. Low intensity treatment. It's part of a multi-year plan to eradicate the broom and acacia and restore a healthier oak woodland.
Great. Next one.
What you're looking at here is French broom removal and roadside vegetation at the top of the Christmas Tree Hill neighborhood in Corte Madera. This is again on the boundary of the community, immediately adjacent to some of the areas that will be treated under the shaded fuel break plan. Essentially, what we did create was on a smaller scale, a shaded fuel break in a critical location for firefighter safety and to provide firefighters a location where they can safely suppress a fire that's spreading from one canyon to the next towards the town of Corte Madera. This is one of my favorite photos. This is a redwood forest, a recovering redwood forest near the top of Christmas Tree Hill. What we found just last year were really incredibly unhealthy conditions because of years of fire suppression. A large number of small diameter redwoods had died in place, unable to grow because of the lack of spacing between trees, the inability to get nutrients and sunlight. What we did was remove nothing but dead vegetation. No living vegetation was removed in this photo. We provided additional spacing, really improved habitat for some of the native species in the area, including northern spotted owls and other animals that are now have a better environment to thrive in. And we greatly reduced the risk of wildfire spreading through this by removing the buildup of dead vegetation on the ground and the lower limbs of the trees, which will in turn protect those trees when a fire does occur, protect the canopy of those trees from burning. This is another piece of roadside vegetation project that created a shaded fuel break adjacent to a road in Corte Madera. This was exclusively the removal of dead vegetation that had been pushed over the side of the road, accumulating, suppressing the growth of native plants, and then a huge infestation of French broom. By removing the French broom and then providing follow-up removals, we just completed a second pass at following up and removing the new sprouts of French broom. We think over time we can suppress the broom here, provide a much safer evacuation route and additional reduction in fire intensity should a fire burn here adjacent to the structures. And you can't see them in this photo, but there are several homes within 200 feet of this location.
Thanks. Okay, so one of the goals that we mentioned at the start of the presentation was not just to plan out this project in the field treatments, but also to complete the environmental review so that the implementation can commence and continue each year. So due to the size and the type of work that's proposed, the nature of the work, this project fell under the California Vegetation Treatment Program EIR, the Cal VTP EIR for short. And that is a certified program EIR covering vegetation management across the whole state within state responsibility areas. Since the VTP is a certified EIR, projects that fall under it go through a process to determine if the work is within the scope of that EIR. And so a project-specific analysis, or PSA, is prepared, and that looks a lot like a CEQA checklist. And the analysis in that PSA walks through each CEQA parameter and explains how the impacts of the project fall within those identified within the VTP EIR. And then it identifies the standard project requirements and the mitigations from that program environmental impact report that would apply. The PSA also identifies if there are any new or different or greater impacts. And if so, a different process has to be followed, but if not, the project can be found to be within the scope of that EIR, and findings and statements of overriding considerations are prepared, as well as a mitigation monitoring and reporting program for the lead agency's approval, and the approval in this case would be the MWPA's board. So as part of the PSA process, biological reconnaissance surveys were completed already for this project, as well as desktop analyses, agricultural resource records searches, and we looked at archaeological sensitivity in order to define what measures need to be applied to this project. The program EIR identifies the surveys that must be completed on the ground prior to work and the measures to be implemented if any resources are found. So, those measures are what applies here. We identify them. They apply to every project that falls under the VTP EIR. And many of the typical measures that MWPA has been applying to many of the other projects, smaller projects going on, are very similar, or came from the VTP, including in particular nesting bird surveys, if work is to occur in nesting season. And Breakout Room 3 will provide more details on the resource impacts and the VTP and the California Environmental Quality Act process that I just described here. This was meant to be just a really high overview. Next slide. So the project will require landowner participation. Homeowners are responsible for a defensible space on their lands up to 100 feet or the property line. And this project will give landowners the opportunity to work with MWPA and Central Marin Fire for additional field break work on private land. And if you have specific questions about the location of the field break, private land work, etc., you can visit Breakout Room 2 regarding the field break location. That's the modeling room as well, where Todd will be in there and he might be able to help you with your questions. And just as a note, the final, there'll be a second meeting likely in June or July prior to implementation, to discuss how the implementation will work on this project. So after the PSA is completed. Next slide. This slide just shows the schedule. We expect to have the PSA completed around May and approved. Implementation would take anywhere from 3 to 5 years for initial treatments, depending on funding and grants, but work under this program is going to include maintenance. So we see this as a long-term process, because even as some areas are being started, other areas may need the maintenance started already. So it's a continuous cycle of work once it gets started under this program. And the PSA provides coverage for up to 10 years, at which point then it has to be, the conditions reevaluated, but it does allow for that continued maintenance and work. Last slide. Okay, so now we'd like to open it up to questions. We have just about 10 or 15 minutes or so. I think our timing worked out really nice here. And then we'll break the room up into breakout rooms. And I'll come back on after the question and answer to provide you some more instructions on how to do the breakout rooms after the Q&A. Right now, if you have questions in this main room, we ask that you type them in the chat, and Emily will read off your questions, and then we'll do our best to answer them or to provide commentary, your comments. And then after about 10 minutes or so, I'll come back on and we'll start the breakout session.
Tanya, so the first question we received in the chat was, to what extent could the break be accessed or driven along by fire vehicles or work crew vehicles? I think Todd was going to answer this one maybe.
Yeah, for the most part, the fuel break itself is not intended to be accessed by fire vehicles. Because this fuel break in almost its entirety is within 200 feet of a structure, our access to the area in the fuel break would be through people's driveways and directly from their home, where we would work to protect houses and suppress a fire there. There may be sections of this project that are within reach of different roads, including fire roads, and in some cases paved roads or other driveways. So there would be places to access it, but this is not intended to be a place where we would drive.
The second question we got was, what was the meaning of the numbers of the segments on the map? Is that the order of priority?
Yes, so the segments are the guidelines for the order of priority, but as I mentioned, it doesn't have to be in that order. Opportunities may come up to do things in a different order, based upon other opportunities, other treatments being done, grants, etc. But it's meant to be the guide of the order. Starting at 1 will provide the most benefit quickest.
I would add to that the ordering has been really informative to the fire agencies as we look at what a wildfire might do in and around the community. It's based on some great science that you'll learn about in that breakout room on the fire modeling. But again, this project we think will be completed so quickly that in many ways the ordering doesn't matter.
And again, in the room, we're just going to do chat comments. So no need to raise your hand. If you do want to raise your hand and speak, we'll do that in the breakout room. So just a reminder.
Next question, are you using IPM for any treatments of the fuel breaks?
So I guess I can address that. Yes and no. Right now, the intent is that the vast majority of the work will be conducted using hand tools and hand methods, but the analysis does look at the use of different methods that might be contained in an IPM type regime. So right now, the intent is that it's primarily going to be mechanical hand methods, with the potential for herbicide application in limited places.
Thank you. Will Measure A renewal support this work?
And I'll take that one. And I believe, yes, it can definitely help with this project, because some of the portions of this project will be in Marin County parks and open space land. And if they have dedicated funding to be able to perform that work within those segments, then that allows us to free up MWPA monies for areas outside of the Marin County parks and open space lands. And part of the ordinance language is for the MWPA and Marin County parks to enter into a contract with each other on how we're going to cooperate between Measure A and Measure C and the work that we all need to get done.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention with this question too that most of the areas that we're really concerned about and the boundary of this fuel break are areas that have seen years of deferred maintenance. So our hope is that Measure A might support the long-term maintenance of this project. The goal is not that the fire agencies or the Measure C become responsible for the long-term maintenance of all of this land. It's not our land. But we recognize that the landowners, whether they're public or private, can use some help right now in catching up on the deferred maintenance and tackling some of these bigger problems like invasives. And we hope that this will give them a piece of ground that's much easier to maintain in a healthy state in the long term.
Thank you. The next chat mentions a New York Times story on California fires. This isn't the California I married, and it includes a link.
It is an interesting article. I read it. It's interesting.
I haven't read this one, but I'm reading things like that. I'm going to add that to my bookmarks.
The next one asks about a typical home. And unfortunately, I think it was probably in reference to a particular slide, and I'm not quite sure which one. So.
I think we can go to the next one.
Next one.
The next one says, fuel breaks seem useless. The Tubbs fire hopped 6 lanes of freeway. The fires create their own wind and work nighted in forests horribly stressed by drought and mostly pines.
This is a critical one that we're going to address in great detail in some of the breakout rooms, but I'd like to address it to some extent here. Fuel breaks can mean several different things to firefighters. There are fuel breaks that we create sometimes with multiple bulldozers while fighting a fire that are intended or hopefully intend to stop the spread of a fire. The shaded fuel break like this at the periphery of a community is not intended to stop the spread of a fire. That's not our goal at all. So it will work. It will do what we intend it to do, which is reduce the intensity of fire when it reaches structures and provide firefighters a place to suppress fire, provide a safer evacuation process for residents who are in those homes, and slow down the ignition of homes at the edge of the community to give us time to stop the fire from igniting the homes at the edge of the community, which then generate the millions of embers that spread to other homes. So yes, it's true. During conditions like the Tubbs fire, a shaded fuel break will not stop the fire. But again, that's not our goal. It never has been our goal with this type of work. The goal is to reduce the intensity of the fire. And in the places where shaded fuel breaks existed, I would point you to Fox Hill Place at the top of Fountain Grove in that community. The only 15 homes that survived in that community were the 15 homes that were adjacent to the shaded fuel break that had recently been created. So that was, even under terrible conditions, the only homes that survived were the ones immediately adjacent to this type of work.
Thank you. The next question is, how are you defining a healthy forest?
I can address that in relation to ecology. A healthy forest should be a forest that supports a wide diversity of different age classes of different plants and a diversity of wildlife and plant species. A lot of the forests that have fire suppression, you'll see have all the same age class represented. And so clearing out some of the understory can help to support a healthy forest. It's also, of course, healthier in relation to being able to undergo a large fire and not completely burn. The example photo that Todd showed with the redwoods is a really great example of this, because fire can just pass under those redwoods that have been cleared of dead debris and won't go up in the canopy because that understory material has been removed. But yeah, we've also found there's great studies out there that have shown diversity of age class also supports a higher biodiversity of bird life and other wildlife in the ecosystem.
Thanks, Grace. I'll add just a few notes here that we're working with various partners around Marin County to tackle just this question. It's a complicated question and it requires a lot of great local experts and great minds to tackle it. So we're meeting periodically to discuss what is forest health for Marin County for different types of forests and landscapes.
Thank you. The next one was just a comment that maybe everybody should get a goat, which I agree. The next one was, how will you handle those who object to tree removal? What if there's an owl or nesting bird in the tree?
I think this is a question that we receive a lot in all of the projects we're doing, but it's critical to this one. We're proposing to build a shaded fuel break, and the shade word is really indicative of what we're trying to do here. This project does not intend to remove any mature trees, mature native trees on the landscape. Our goal is to protect those trees, leave them in place. They provide shade, which increases the moisture that's retained near the ground level, reduces temperatures underneath the canopy, greatly reduces the fire intensity. So this is not a project about tree removal. This is a project about tree retention more than anything, and protecting those trees because of the benefit they provide to fires near the community. The types of trees that the native trees on our landscape here do not typically, when they're healthy, contribute greatly to a wildfire. We don't see canopy fires like you might see in a ponderosa pine forest in the Sierra Nevadas, for example.
I would just add that we'll also be making sure that we're preventing any impacts to nesting birds, whether that's doing surveys during the appropriate season or whatever needs to occur. So even if we're just cutting grass or low-lying vegetation, we'll be still looking out for nesting birds as well.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe like a couple more, and then if we don't get to everybody's chat now, we definitely encourage folks to go to the different breakout rooms and ask questions there as well. But we'll take maybe a couple more. Another one is, can you please indicate the timing of when the various segments shown will be treated? What will you do to address the very steep areas that are fuel choked?
So as far as timing, I think you're going to see work begin likely this August with the allocation of approximately $1 million from the MWPA core funds for the Central Marin Zone. We're also pursuing CAL FIRE fire prevention grant of about $3 million. Depending on the receipt of that grant, the award of that grant, it could accelerate the timeline. But in general, we will likely follow the numerical ordering to some extent that's been suggested through the analysis, with work beginning this fall and probably lasting about 2 to 3 years for the initial treatment.
And then for very steep areas, I think that those areas will be visited as the work, prior to the work being done. So as we mentioned, before any work is done on the ground, there is another step of fine tuning. And so while some of those areas were hard to identify what field treatments, once they're visited, there may be some things that could be done by hand. And there are, different methods that could be used. Mechanical equipment would be used in very steep areas, but there may be some work that still could be done.
Thank you. There were a couple questions about commenting on the PSA, and so I thought maybe Tanya, you could just speak to that for the larger group.
Yeah, so the PSA is not, it's not quite the same process as a whole, new program EIR. It is, what we're doing is we're stating that this is essentially becomes one of the projects under that overall program EIR, which already had its public review, comment, and certification. And so really what we're doing, we're not coming up with new mitigation. We're basically working directly within the framework of that certified document to show that how these activities fall within that document. And we're identifying, what mitigation, what standard measures apply to this project that were identified in the document. And so while there isn't, the same sort of 45-day public review in the EIR, the PSA does go for board approval. And so there may be some opportunity at that point, similar to other documents that are being approved, for the public to look at it. I don't know if Anne had any more to comment on that, but okay, yeah, I think that's generally the process. The room 3 will go over that a little more. So if you have more questions, we can clarify there. And also along those lines, the PSA is including an addendum to address the areas that are outside the treatable landscape. This project, because it's at the really, it falls in and out of the treatable landscape. There's definitely a substantial portion in the treatable landscape, which allows us to do an addendum. Many of the areas that are in the local responsibility areas are very similar. They're adjacent to the areas that are in the SRA. And so we are preparing an addendum to cover those areas. And with that, I think, Emily, maybe we should go to the last slide and the breakout room. And again, we've got these questions. Once they're in the chat, we do have them recorded, and but also we encourage folks to ask those questions in the rooms. So let me quickly go over how the breakout room works, and I will have Emily jump in if I miss anything. But there's going to be 3 breakout room options for you, and you can visit them in any order. And again, we encourage you, don't all just go to room 1. Let's mix it up. We've got, about 80 people on this call. And so we ideally would like to have it split up, fairly evenly between the 3 rooms. That will give more folks more chance to talk. So you can go to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a little icon called Breakout Rooms. And then from there, you can pick which room you want to join. And once it's opened up, and then you just join that room. And when we're done in the room, you can click on the same breakout rooms, exit the room, you'll come back to the main room, and then you'll have the option to pick a different breakout room. The way that we like this to work is that each room will have staff from Central Marin, MWPA, Panorama, Vibrant Planet, Sequoia. We'll provide you additional information, and we'll take questions and feedback. When we're in the rooms, we ask that you raise the hand function. And if you'd like to speak, or you could put a message in the chat box. We will start each room with a little focused mini presentation, but again, the point there is really to have an interactive experience. Each room will run for about 15 minutes. And then once that 15 minutes is up, we'll let you know. And that's the time for everyone to exit the room. You'll go back to the main room real quick, and then you pick the second room. And then after a minute or 2, we'll let people do that switch, and then we'll do the presentation again. So each room will have the same presentation of information, so you don't need to visit room 1 twice, for example. The idea is to go between the rooms. And then you're welcome to go to one of the rooms, or 2 of them, or all of them, or leave now. It's up to you. We're leaving that open-ended. At the end of the hour, the rooms are going to close. But you can exit Zoom whenever you like. And just to let you know, we're not all going to come back to this larger group and convene. So once we break out into the groups, then we'll do the groups, and then the meeting will end. And I do want to bring up one other point. If you would like to be on a future email notification list, you can go into the chat box, and this is really at any time, and you can select private chat message with Kate Medlock, one of our folks, and then just enter your name and email address, and she'll compile a mailing list from that.
No one can see there are no icons on the screen for us to tap into the rooms, please. So you're gonna have to provide some clarification. There's nothing on the screen that we can click on to go into the rooms. Thank you.
Okay, Emily, do we need to?
We should be able to just,
I think is it set to assign people to rooms right now?
Can't see it.
You're right, it is actually set to assign, but it shouldn't have been. So let me try one more time. I'm gonna close the rooms and open them one more time. Okay, give me 1 second.
Perhaps your PowerPoint is in the way of.
Okay, here we go. Now I think.
Yeah, it's saying right now to assign the room instead of giving people choice.
If you scroll to the bottom, you should be able to see.
It's fine, we can do it.
Join.
It's here now.
Can't see it.
Okay.
It's
Oh,
all
there you
there
go.
now.
Join. Okay, got it. We can also assign you, apparently.
Thank
We
you.
won't do that.
We won't.
Okay. So with that, why doesn't everyone go ahead and join the rooms, and we'll be in there in a minute. And then Emily, you'll give a warning when it's about time to switch, right? Okay, sounds good. All right, we'll see you guys in the rooms. Like people are getting there.
Years of experience on fire suppression and incorporating shaded fuel breaks into fire suppression planning. So it's actually a great opportunity to ask him around about how shaded fuel breaks work in terms of fighting a fire. So before we dive into the details, and Caitlin's going to dive into a couple of slides here, I want to take just one moment and return to the bigger picture context for the project. And this will be really brief, but you know, as Todd articulated and Mark as well, you know, in the thousands of years before Euro-Americans settled in this area, the landscapes here in Marin and elsewhere in California saw frequent fire from Native American land stewardship practices and, you know, to a lesser extent, lightning strikes. And that frequent low to moderate intensity fire cleared out the understories of our forests and woodlands and really kept that biomass accumulation in check. And then foresters with European training took a look at the fire in our forests and saw it as really something to fix. So they stopped Native Americans from burning, became very good at fire suppression, and all that biomass that would have been cleared out every 5, 10, 15 years in our plant communities has accumulated to unnatural levels. So in many areas, you know, some of these areas haven't seen fire in a century. So additionally, on top of that, we have non-native invasive plants crowding into our wildlands and making a bad situation worse. With dry seasons growing longer from climate change, we're seeing a lot of drought-stressed, ready-to-burn vegetation in our landscapes, and also right up against our back fences. The project we're discussing tonight is one of many strategies that the MWPA is pursuing with our member agencies. And you know, all of those strategies are important. We're working on home hardening and defensible space and helping people fund that work. Evacuation planning, alerts. It's a really complex problem that requires a systems approach. And we plan on pursuing a variety of different solutions. So tonight, we're just going to talk about one of those strategies, and that's shaded fuel breaks next to homes and neighborhoods. Because this project is right up against back fences of homes, we're not proposing to return, you know, broadcast burns, low intensity fire to the project area right now. But for anyone listening who's been involved in prescribed burns and who has helped prepare a burn unit, you know, some of this, you know, for example, with some of the local nonprofits or maybe a fire agency, a lot of the work that we're talking about for this project should sound very familiar. It's a lot like the kind of work you would do, and I've done in the past, with a crew of fellow coworkers or volunteers to reduce ladder fuels and keep fire out of the canopy and make sure that all your healthy, mature native trees stick around. So, and also, you know, that if you don't do that, your controlled burn might not be so controlled anymore. And it's really the same idea with a shaded fuel break. You're reducing fuels to turn down the temperature on the next fire that could come rushing toward our homes from the wildlands, or conversely could come from a vehicle or power line or backyard grill and rush into our wildlands. So turning down the temperature in that area through good vegetation management means that people have more time to get out of the way, and firefighters are more likely to be successful in these neighborhoods. So with that, I'll hand it off to Caitlin Gillerin, who's going to dive into the details of our fuel management techniques in the project area, and then we'll open it up to more Q&A. And please feel free to ask lots of questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anne. So Anne walked through really the overall purpose and goals and really the history behind why this project and why these types of techniques and treatment types are proposed. So I think I'll just kind of jump into the nitty gritty since we've already gone through that part. So the overall intent of this project is we'll generally have a fuel reduction zone within this 200, 300 foot area, and then we'll have the forest health restoration area. And there's a nice little depiction here that kind of high level provides an overview of what that could look like. So the fuel reduction zone, that could be up to 100, 150 feet from structures, and then more from the 100 to 150 foot zone and beyond, that would be more the forest health restoration area. And some of the differences, fuel reduction with that goal in mind, that's more for a defensible space, can be, depending on site conditions, a little bit higher intensity. There could be some more removal of vegetation to achieve the appropriate vertical and horizontal spacing that CAL FIRE and fire agencies recommend to minimize the travel, of the fire across the landscape. It also would reduce the ladder fuels going up into the canopy. And then in that forest health restoration zone, that would be more focused, a little bit lower intensity, likely. This all depends on site conditions, but that's more your removal of dead and dying vegetation, invasive species, that to prevent the canopy fires, essentially. And this is all really achieving that goals and purpose that Anne was mentioning of reducing the wildfire intensity, bringing us back to a more fire resilient landscape, which is what it was pre-fire suppression. So I do want to touch briefly on, because once the PSA is released, I do want to mention that the CalVTP has specific terminology and treatment types that will also be used. But ultimately, the actual project has this fuel reduction and forest health restoration within the shaded fuel break, but we'll be using terms such as wildland urban interface fuel reduction, as well as fuel break, shaded fuel break, in order to describe what these treatment activities are and what this zone is. So I will just, and do we want to take questions on each slide, or shall we wait until the end? Either way. Anne, I don't know if you had an opinion.
I just want to make sure people have a chance to get their questions answered, please.
Okay, I'll just high level walk through the treatment methods here. So we did see a question, I apologize, I'll start over here. So high level, you could take a look at the methods here. Based on the modeling, the majority of the treatment will be using manual methods. In fact, a lot of it will be hand pulling broom, invasive species. This could be loppers, a lot fewer use of chainsaws and mechanical equipment, but that could also occur. In fact, it's actually probably about 80% of the overall area would be manual. Then there's about 17% based on the modeling that was fairly steep or had a low canopy cover. And that would be, they'd go out in the field and determine whether or not treatment would occur. And in those areas, it's possible that manual treatment would occur. So it's actually about, if treatment occurs, it would be about 90%, 99% of the project would be done using manual treatments. And then there would be about 1% using ground-based mechanicals. That could be masticators or tractors with masticating heads, masticating and mulching materials. In any area, there could also be prescribed herbivory used prior to, during, or after treatments to help with pre-treatment or afterwards. And that's using livestock, typically goats, as they're the best for fine fuels reduction and woody forbs and shrubs and that sort of thing. And Todd already mentioned high level that herbicides may be used, but very minute, kind of working with the land managers, landowners, and based on site conditions, if the types of invasive species kind of appear to necessitate that to keep those under control. This slide also presents the 3 biomass processing methods that could be implemented. That would be pile burning, air current burning, and chipping. And for chipping, that would be chipping to the appropriate size to ensure that there's no wildfire risk that you're encouraging. And then if it's broadcast on site, or it may also be trucked off potentially to a composting facility. So I just want to keep that brief. So I think we better turn over to the comments here. So Pamela.
Okay, I just unmuted myself. Okay, so just a couple of quick things. What is your plan and how will you work around special species? And the second question is restoration. What are you talking about with restoration? Are you planting? Are you, what exactly, what does that plan look like? Thank you.
Thanks so much. So, oh yeah, Anne, if you want to go ahead.
No, I was, why don't you, you know, some of that heads into what's included in the project-specific requirements under the CalBTP. There are a lot of requirements around botanical surveys and other things, but Caitlin, I'll let you cover that. And then there's more detail in another room on the CalBTP and those requirements.
Yes, that was exactly what I was going to say. So the CalBTP has a set of those specific project requirements as well as mitigation measures that this project is required to adhere to. And it depends on the site conditions and what sort of species could occur. And we'll be outlining in the PSA all of the species based on a desktop as well as reconnaissance surveys that have occurred and identifying which measures will be implemented when. And Tanya also mentioned during the presentation that MWPA has a set of project design and implementation features that are also designed to ensure that special status plant species and wildlife are not affected significantly. And then to your second point, that was regarding restoration and what does that mean in a forest. And Anne, I think that you have talked about this a bit already, so.
Yeah, the restoration piece is interesting because there's, you know, Measure C funding and what we can use Measure C funding versus, you know, what some of the restoration activities out there are. We're using some outside funding, hopefully, for this as well. So a lot of the work that we're doing that's kind of restoration related is removal of invasive species. We've seen in several project sites already that once we remove broom species that are just out competing everything there, then we see a lot of, you know, natives popping up in those areas. We're pretty excited about that. I'm thinking of Chapman Drive and a whole bunch of broom that got pulled and some perennial natives that are coming up there. So there are opportunities out there for additional restoration activities, but we have to be very careful in terms of what we use Measure C funding for.
Thank you, Anne. And do we have any other hand raising? I believe we just have another couple minutes here.
Belle Cole asked a question in chat.
Oh, sorry, I missed that.
Yeah.
Oh, great, here. So Bella Cole, you asked biomass processing. How do you decide which method to follow? Where does it go? Do you keep records of where it goes?
It is a great question. Belle is a great person to ask that question. So Belle and many others are working on a study around biomass and carbon and what to do with biomass that gets produced in Marin County, either by MWPA and MWPA projects or other entities. And so the process through the CalVTP is, limited in terms of terminology for everything really, and around biomass as well. But for us, we're really interested in working with Bell and the results of that study that's going to be getting underway soon, so we can find creative ways to deal with biomass and find ways to reuse, to sequester, and to work with our partners on that.
And I will just add slightly to your first question about how do you decide. It really depends a lot on site conditions and access. I would say for hauling off site, it's probably not going to happen in most locations because access is fairly limited, as they are within 200, 300 feet of homes. There aren't a lot of roads and access. So most of the materials will stay on site. And Todd kind of mentioned that when he was talking about pile burning for that acacia removal project. You would pile burn there, or you would chip on site and leave those materials to degrade. Any other questions?
I think we're about to get the high sign from our
I think so too.
logistics folks today
Yes.
time to move to the next room. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
And just like Ann said, this is room number 1 because it's the best room.
How do we change rooms?
Yeah, so if you just go to the little chat bar that has like your mute and your video button, there should be an option that says breakout rooms. And so you will just select that, and then you can click, say, room 2 or room 3, and you select the join button that should be in blue.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Should we do that now?
Yeah, Bill.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think we'll wait just a moment. Has anybody just come from a room that was actually finishing and everybody was heading out to other rooms, or are they still going?
I just stepped out of room 2 and the discussion was still going, but they encouraged us to move on.
Okay. I think that's going to happen a lot. There's so much to talk about, and 15 minutes goes by very quickly.
Yes.
So maybe we'll wait another moment and then we'll get started. Let's go ahead and get started. We can always backtrack if needed. So this is room 1, and we're going to be talking about treatment types within the project area. I'm Ann Krelock. You met me briefly earlier. I'm the Planning and Program Manager with the MWPA. I'm joined by Mark Brown, who you also met earlier, our Executive Officer, and Caitlin Gillerin with Panorama. And we're going to talk about the activities that would happen within the project area. And then Mark is also, a 30+ year veteran of fire suppression and has spent a lot of time incorporating shaded fuel breaks into fire suppression planning, and is a wealth of knowledge there. So if you have any questions about, what has worked on any major fires, he would be a great resource if you want to ask about that. So before we dive into the slides here, I'm just going to give a little bit of a highlight of some of the big picture stuff that we're considering as we move forward here. So the project we're discussing tonight is one of many strategies that the MWPA and our member agencies are pursuing to address a very, very complicated problem. The accumulation of biomass on our landscapes from lack of fire, years of fire suppression, not allowing the Native American folks to burn these lands. And so an unnatural accumulation of biomass has taken place on these landscapes. And then in addition, we've got non-native invasive plants also coming in and choking our ecosystems. So this is really, and in addition, of course, we've got a changing climate and a longer, more intense dry season, and a future with more severe fires. So it's a complicated problem, and it requires a lot of different solutions, not just one solution. So what we've been doing is pursuing a variety of different solutions, kind of a systems approach. That includes home hardening and defensible space, and working with homeowners to help fund that work, evacuation planning, alerts, and we've, the shaded fuel break strategy is just one of several strategies that we're pursuing. So tonight we're just going to talk about that one strategy. And because this project is right up against the back fences of homes, even though our landscapes are suffering from a lack of fire, we're not proposing to return low intensity fire to the project area right now. But for anyone who's listening, who's helped prepare a burn unit for a prescribed burn with, maybe a local nonprofit or maybe even a fire agency, a lot of this work is going to sound really familiar. It's a lot like the work that you do, and that I've done too, with a crew of volunteers or maybe fellow coworkers to reduce ladder fuels and keep the fire out of the canopy and make sure that your healthy, mature native trees stick around. And then also, if you do that, then maybe your controlled burn will stay controlled. And it's the same idea in a shaded fuel break. You're reducing fuels to turn down the temperature on the next fire that could come rushing towards homes from the wildlands, or conversely could come from homes, power lines, vehicles, backyard grill into the wildlands. Turning down that temperature in the project area through good vegetation management means that people have more time to get out of the way, and firefighters are more likely to be successful in these neighborhoods. And so with that, I'll just hand it off to Caitlin Gillerin, who's really going to be diving into the details of what kinds of fuel management activities would be taking place in the project area. And then feel free to raise your hand with any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Ann. Yeah, so I'll just sort of add on basically to what Ann and Tanya have already talked about this evening. So this overall shaded fuel break zone is going to typically be 200 feet, but it could extend up to 300 feet. But within that overall 300-foot zone that's kind of depicted in this picture here, there's kind of two anticipated levels of intensity that are based on site conditions and regulations and fire agency personnel, their understanding in order to control and reduce the wildfire intensity in these areas, as well as restore the landscape and do a more fire resilient landscape. So this first zone we'll refer to as the fuel reduction zone, and this will be from the structure up to 100, potentially 150 feet. And this may be more intense, more like what CAL FIRE and the fire regulatory agencies describe as the defensible space zone. So this may include more removal of vegetation and shrubs in order to achieve the appropriate horizontal as well as vertical spacing to reduce the fire intensity as it travels both up as well as across the landscape. This also includes removal of invasive species, dead and dying shrubs and trees, hazard trees. It can include trimming of grasses, which could be done, we'll get on the methods page, but this could be using livestock in order to do that. Then beyond this 100 to 150 foot zone, that will be typically a lower intensity, focus more on removal of invasives and non-native fire hazardous vegetation. It can also include removal of dead and dying shrubs and trees, just because those can act to, increase the intensity of fire as it moves through there. And in a more fire resilient landscape, the level of dead and dying and invasives that we have would not be where it is right now. So those are those two main zones, but I do also want to touch on what we'll be seeing once the public sees the PSA. So CalVTP has specific treatment types and terminology that is essentially what this fuel reduction and forest health restoration zone is, but it may look a little bit different. So I do just want to mention the wildland urban interface fuel reduction. So this is very much, it can be both fuel reduction as well as forest health restoration. And the term fuel break, shaded fuel break, that really can encompass both of these types of treatment intensities. So. And now I'll touch on the different types of treatment methods that can be used in order to achieve this desired fuel reduction, forest health restoration, in order to reduce the overall wildfire intensity. So the primary method that's going to be used is really going to be the hand tools manual treatment. In fact, a lot of the project is probably going to be hand pulling of invasives and broom. And this nice little pie chart here is actually based on the modeling that was done for the project. And it shows here that manual is the majority. And then you can see a very tiny, that's actually 1% represented right there, of ground-based mechanical. And if you've been to the modeling room, they've probably walked through how they prioritized and identified that this would occur. And I do just want to touch on that yellow bit that says manual if needed. So that's actually based on the fact that there's about 17% of the project area that from the modeling was identified to either be pretty steep, over 65% slopes, or that the canopy cover was really low. But as this is based on the fine scale vegetation data and other data available, there will be site visits, and on the ground, they may determine, the fire agencies and contractors may identify that treatment is needed based on the conditions that they're actually seeing. And in that case, it's almost definitely going to be manual based on the steepness and the canopy. And for the ground-based mechanical, you can see here that would typically, for that just little 1% area, that could be roadside. You may use a tractor or something with a masticating head, or other areas that have good access, as well as typically lower slopes. You're not going to use equipment generally on fairly steep slopes. And then I do want to touch on the prescribed herbivory, because that is a tool that uses livestock, most typically goats, that can be used before you come in with the manual treatment, or it can be also done afterward as kind of maintenance treatments. You typically actually want to use them in tandem, because if you're going to use goats, they won't actually eat dead and dying. In fact, no livestock does. So you would need to always kind of come in with manual if you do have a lot of dead and dying, or other types of vegetation that they do not preferentially eat. Herbicide application, as Todd mentioned, will be used, but fairly limited locations and limited types of conditions and site conditions. And this is done working with the land managers, landowners, and after doing a site inspection to see what's actually out there. And then we also have on this slide the biomass processing. So there's 3 general types that can be used depending on site conditions and amount of vegetation present. That's pile burning, air curtain burning, and chipping. And for chipping, due to access, as Todd mentioned, since a lot of this is all about 200 feet from people's homes, there's not great access. So it's likely that a lot of chips, if that is used as the method, will be left on site and chipped to the appropriate size and depth in order to ensure that there's no wildfire risk that occurs. So with that, that's just our high level review. Any hands up or questions in the chat? We would be happy to spark a conversation.
You know, while we're waiting for any raised hands, I think I'll just invite Bruce Goins, our board president. Bruce, if you want to talk a little bit about how we're exploring options for biomass in the area. Those, while the Cal VTP process is not particularly expansive in terms of addressing biomass, we're looking into all sorts of options in Marin County on how to process biomass that's produced by NWPA projects or other entities. Bruce, do you mind giving a 1-minute overview of that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the surprise. Today, we inked a contract with the Governor's Office of Planning Research. Marin County, for the last 2 years, there's been a collaborative of environmental and land management interests and people interested in climate change, asking the question, you can do all this treatment, all this vegetation management treatment. What are you going to do with this stuff? Are you going to burn it? Are you going to leave it on site? Or are you going to, is it going to go to a processing facility? You know, could it produce electricity? Could it produce biochar? Could it produce mulch or compost? And the answer is yes, it could produce all of those. So we received a $500,000 grant inked today, where a collaborative here with the support of the Marin Research Conservation District as our fiscal agent, we are going to look into all the proposed vegetation management treatments, what's going to happen where, characterize the material from all the land ownerships, what their plans are in these out years, what we're going to cut, what we're going to do with it. Some we're going to leave in place, some we're going to chip, some we're going to use as mulch. But there are opportunities to move material into through different processes that have different carbon and greenhouse gas benefits, and also can produce some employment and economic opportunities, including the Marin agricultural community. The Marin RCD has around 80 land ownerships who are interested in sequestering carbon on their land using biochar, compost. Anyway, so yeah, we inked the deal today. We're going to take a look at ask everyone who wants to move material or do veg management. What are your proposals? What's your timing? We'll characterize the material. We'll take a look at where the material is currently going and where it might go to optimize the greenhouse gas benefits associated with our work and to minimize adverse effects. So there's no answer. It's asking the question, and thank you to the governor's office. You know, $500,000 is a lot of money. It's a 2-year project. If you have any questions about that, you can contact me, please, or contact Bill Cole, who we can provide information to. But on this slide, the biomass processing, this is it: pile burning, air curtain burning, chipping. There's a whole nother suite. There is pyrolysis to biochar. There is production of heat for small greenhouses. There is biomass to electricity. which you can, feed to on site for electric vehicle recharging, et cetera. We don't know what we're going to do with this material. And so, the biomass processing options here need to be enhanced, and if I may say, instead of 3, there should be 6 or 7. But we are indeed looking at that in the context of minimizing our release of greenhouse gases.
Thanks so much, Bruce. And I know Gerd has a question, and I may be pronouncing your name wrong. I'm sorry if I am. I want to just address, the CalVTP process is very prescriptive and a bit rigid in terms of content and terminology. So some of the nuances we will be looking into for sure around carbon and biomass, and the document may be a little bit limited in terms of how creative we get to be, but
yeah, the CalVTP doesn't require that. It requires a declaration of impacts, and if there's an opportunity to minimize, I think this question of where this stuff goes is going to be a policy decision that Mark Brown, our executive officer, will work with all the member agencies to make decisions, as to where to most effectively move that material, where we can move it. It won't be prescriptive, but there are dozens of people who are involved in this stuff. The VTP EIR just says declare, and then it's for us. I think MWPA made Mark, you may say this, but in the basis of the MWPA, the authority, it in essence says that we will do, I think, a climate friendly or climate responsible. I forget what the wording is, but we're committed to trying to fill that wording that the voters supported when they supported Measure C.
And yeah, you're right. But I do want to move on to GERD because we are actually at the time where we're supposed to rotate. So I'd love to hear GERD's question. Sorry about that.
So
Bruce.
quickly.
Yeah, me too. Sorry.
Yeah, just a quick one. First of all, thank you very much. This is incredibly well prepared and presented. So tremendous work that you've done there. What I'm wondering is, where did we go wrong? Because it feels like we've forgotten how to properly maintain public open spaces, our forests. Is that a matter of funding? Is that a matter of education? Was it just some misconceptions? Where did we go wrong, and how do we make sure that we get it right going forward?
Oh, that's a big one. Do you have an hour?
Or more.
I do.
Mark, why don't you take it?
It's not really. I don't think it's an answer that we can really. It's a culmination of not knowing our environment as well as we should have for centuries, where other people who had cohabitated with their environment and managed things much better, and people came in with the less understanding of what was right for the environment, and we were convinced we were right in doing that, going down that road, and we're paying for it now. That's the super short answer.
I think we had, foresters 150 years ago who had no understanding of fire and the role of fire in these landscapes, and they were looking at, how to make wood for use. And I think that was a big piece of it. And we prohibited Native American burning, and now we've got 100 years worth of no burning and a hole to dig ourselves out of, and the changing climate on top of that, and non-native plants invading our wildlands. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us.
We do have to encourage you to move on to your next room if you want to go on to another room. Same way you guys did last time. Thank you, Bruce, for stepping in unexpectedly. And,
Thanks, Bruce.
We'll look forward to the next group coming in, which some of them are already getting here.
All right. Let's see. Well, let's get started. It's 7:43. We've got these times go by so quickly. So I'm Ann Prelock. I'm the Planning and Program Manager with the MWPA. We've got Mark Brown here, who you met earlier, and who has 3 decades plus of experience in fire suppression. If you want to ask him about how shaded fuel breaks factor into fire suppression, he is a great resource for that. We've got Caitlin Gillerin, who's going to help present on this topic. So you're in room number 1. We're going to cover treatment types that, that would take place within the project area. What kinds of activities are we talking about and where? So we'll dive into that a little bit. I'm going to give just a little bit of context. It's come up in previous breakout sessions. So, you know, the problem that we're addressing is so complicated. It's, you know, we have 100+ years of fire suppression, very good fire suppression. We stopped allowing our Native American tribes to burn on these lands. And so ecosystems that we're seeing low intensity or moderate intensity fire every 5, 10, 15, 20 or so years stopped seeing that. And so that biomass has accumulated over time. Plus, we've seen non-native invasive plants coming into our wildlands and really choking our oak woodlands and our other systems. And you know, we've got a changing climate that means a longer dry season and more intense rains in the wet season and more heat. So we are looking at a future with more severe fire. In the past, when these fires would roll through, there would be a smaller percent of those fires that would be kind of a stand replacing event. And now we're seeing more and more percentages of those fires being stand replacing. So it's not just more fire, it's more severe fire. We actually have on some of these landscapes a lack of fire problem. So we haven't seen those low intensity burns. So we've seen this vegetation kind of pile up and it's drought stressed and accumulating, and we're seeing a high fire risk. And so we're trying to address that issue in a number of different ways. We are working with residents to provide funding for home hardening and defensible space around homes. We're working on evacuation planning, tracking, studying evacuation and potential barriers to evacuation, alerts, alert systems, and a variety of different tools, and shaded fuel breaks is one of those tools. This project, you know, would mean vegetation management right up to the back fences of the residents in these neighborhoods. And the idea here is really to turn down the temperature on the fire that would be coming maybe from the wildlands towards these residences, or even from residences, you know, power lines, vehicles, backyard grills into wildlands. And that gives people more time to get out, and it gives firefighters a better chance to fight that fire. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Caitlin Gillerin, who's going to dive into the details and talk about some of the management techniques within the project area.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. So I'm just going to add on to what Tanya had talked about in the main presentation, add perhaps a little bit more information here, and really how is it that we are going to achieve this goal that Anne is talking about. So within this, what we're referring to as the overall, the shaded fuel break, there actually are kind of different levels of intensity for the treatment in order to achieve slightly different goals here and there. So we have the fuel reduction kind of zone, and then the forest health restoration zone within the overall 200 to 300 foot fuel break. And all of this is going to be dependent on what Todd and Anne mentioned, and Tanya, that the fire agency personnel and the contractors are going to go out and do a site inspection in order to determine the different distances and the intensity depending on each location. So this first zone, the fuel reduction zone, is kind of from the house out to 100 up to 150 feet. And this may be more intense. This could result in more removal in order to achieve the vertical and horizontal spacing that's required. This would be following the local as well as CAL FIRE guidelines for a defensible space. And we call this fuel reduction, and because you're trying to reduce the intensity of the fire as it's going across the landscape and minimize the potential for it to go up into the canopy. So this also includes removal of invasive species that are pretty brushy and they really fill in, and there are a lot more vegetation there than if it was a more wildfire resistant and resilient landscape as it was before fire suppression efforts and also before pre-contact when we brought these invasive species in. This will also be dead and dying trees and shrub removal, and it could include trimming of grasses, which may be done, as we'll get into on the methods page, with prescribed herbivory as well as handheld tools. And then beyond the 100 to 150 foot zone, this is typically going to be lower intensity, more focused on just achieving that sort of wildfire resilient landscape. So that's more focused on just invasive removal, which does help reduce the wildfire going up into the canopy, as well as removal of dead and dying vegetation and potentially limbing up of trees to mimic the conditions that might occur in a natural environment. I also wanted to touch on some terminology that once the PSA is released, the public will end up seeing, just so everybody's familiarized with it. So the terms wildland urban interface fuel reduction and this term fuel break will be used to describe the different zones, but ultimately within this WUI fuel reduction and fuel break, that fuel reduction and forest health restoration, different treatment types will be occurring within there based on, the site conditions that are present. All right, now I'm going to switch over to how it is that we will be achieving this on the ground. So I think I'll just start high level. If you've been to the modeling, you've probably heard some of this before, but we have a nice little pie chart here showing what the modeling found to be the most efficient way to achieve the goals and purpose of the fuel break, which is a more wildfire resilient landscape and to reduce the intensity of wildfire and minimize the catastrophic wildfires. So they found that actually using hand tools and manual treatments was most effective for over 80% of the overall shaded fuel break area. And then actually, if you look, you just see the ground-based mechanical is really only going to be a few percent, pretty small area of the overall fuel break. And this is likely due to access, slope, site conditions, and the types of vegetation that are present. And then I'll just highlight this manual if needed segment there. That's about 17% of the overall project area. So that was actually through the modeling, they found that the slopes were over 65% and that the canopy cover was pretty low. So modeling wise, they didn't necessarily identify a treatment, but once the on the ground site inspections are conducted, the fire agency personnel may determine that actually the conditions do necessitate or it is feasible to conduct manual treatments. But due to that, the fact that it is going to be steeper slopes and lower canopy, it's definitely going to be manual treatments. So manual treatments, a lot of it's actually going to be hand pulling. You're going to have crews out there hand pulling broom or even cutting with loppers. They're going to be using non-mechanical loppers and pole pruners to be trimming up, limbing up trees and removing the smaller vegetation. There can definitely chainsaws and string trimmers and mechanical equipment will be used depending on the site conditions. So I'll just touch on the ground-based mechanical. You're going to be using it such as along roadsides. You may have a tractor or a skid steer with a masticating head, and they can come through and do 10, maybe up to 15 foot swath and trim up some of that, a lot of invasives or grasses, and keep those short and minimize ignition potential. All right, so prescribed herbivory, I know somebody had a question and we weren't able to answer it in the main room. So that's basically using livestock in order to achieve your fuel reduction and the goals of your fuel break. So typically goats are going to be used because they're really good for the fine fuels, but you can also, livestock includes cattle, sheep. Every single livestock species has different preferences for what they eat and when you can use them best and for what lengths of time. So goats are most likely going to be used because you can do really targeted pre-treatment or even post-treatment. And prescribed herbivory goes really well with manual treatment. because the livestock does not actually eat dead vegetation. So you can come in, remove dead vegetation, and then have your goats come in right afterward. And then they can help maintain that area for several years or more. Every year you can have your goats come in and keep it all, find fuels low. Herbicide application, Todd discussed this during the main presentation. So it will be used, but it is going to be used in limited locations and based on really the conditions, working with the landowners, land managers to determine what's appropriate for each site. It's going to be used for invasive species such as acacia, eucalyptus, and broom. It's very effective. And it also pairs well with the manual. You may cut down the debris, move out your eucalyptus or your broom, and then you may do spot treatment or painting on stump treatment. It minimizes the maintenance. So then you're not gonna have a crew having to come in 10 years and cut all the eucalyptus down again, as an example. But this will be used sparingly at agency discretion. And the biomass processing that we have outlined here are 3 main types. At the previous session, if anybody has lingered since then, we did start talking about a lot of other options that may be used for some of the vegetative debris. But these are the kind of main high-level key ones. So it could be pile burning, air curtain burning, chipping, and either you leave it on site or you may take it away for processing. And you can even do that if you just limb. So if you're lopping and you have debris, you can also take it. And then there's a lot of other options that if there's questions, I'm sure we can start answering some of those. So how do you decide what biomass processing to do? Well, that's really site conditions. Todd talked about this in the main presentation, that access is going to be pretty limited across a lot of the site. So you're probably not going to be trucking away any materials for a large portion of the site. You're going to have to find some way in the vicinity. So that's typically pile burning. It's actually used by a lot of land managers and fire agencies already in Marin. So they have a lot of great experience doing that. Or chipping, that would be chipped to the appropriate size and left on site at the appropriate depth in order to ensure that it doesn't increase wildfire hazard. Anyway, so that's very high level. I think now we can jump into questions, Q&A time. All right. Looks like, I think these are, Judy, you're definitely in our room. I've seen you. Okay, yes, you have your hand raised. Yes.
Got my hand raised. I just want to let you know there's three chat questions. Actually, I think I've got a 4th one too, but I don't want to hog everything. So.
Okay, yeah, perfect. So I'll just start walking through. I'll start with your first one. Sometimes coyote bush is cleared, but it's an environmentally important native plant. Are you leaving these important plants?
I can start addressing that, and then Caitlin, feel free to chime in. And then I know Mark, has a lot of good insight on continuity of fuels and things. So the idea here is not to have a parking lot of dirt outside of our communities, but to reduce the horizontal and vertical continuity fuels. That's kind of the lingo that's often used. But here and there, shrubs will remain, probably more shrubs in the second 100 feet, because the first 100 feet will be more related to defensible space and fire fuel reduction, and the second 50 feet, 100 feet, whatever the project in that spot ends up being, will be more akin to kind of forest health restoration type activities. And so some coyote brush will be removed and some will stay, and probably more removed closer to homes. We do absolutely value shrub habitat in addition to forest types, but we just need to reduce risk nearest to the homes. So some of the folks who will be out in the field will be making those determinations. And then as those project areas cross into like Marin County Parks and Open Space lands, they have priorities and stewardship goals as well. So the project will address and incorporate those. I don't know, that was kind of long-winded. Was there anything else, Caitlin or Mark, you want to add to that?
No, that was great. Thank you so much.
I
think
just
you hit
want
it.
to add in that about 100 species, I believe, rely on coyote bush. It's when I say it's critical, it's important. It is important.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree. Regarding goats and invasive weeds, I know that there have been discussions previously, and Mark has more information, I think, on this, but sometimes when you go through and you do an initial treatment, the seed bank, will flush, and if there's already existing non-natives in that seed bank, sometimes they will flush as well. I know that has happened, and then subsequent treatments have controlled those non-natives. Mark, I think you have maybe more insight on that.
I do know that where, especially the Terra Linda Divide, where goat grazing's been very active, they're actually starting to see the return of natives. It didn't happen after the first year, but after the first several years, we're starting to see the return of the natives because of the lack of competition from the non-natives.
Thanks, Mark. Regarding herbicides, I don't think we have specifics on what herbicides would be used. I think that herbicides will be used very, very, very small amounts. I mean, really specifically, trying to get rid of eucalyptus and broom. If you're not pulling broom, but you're cutting at the stump, it'll regrow. Eucalyptus is really problematic. It becomes really brushy and even more of kind of a ladder fuel if you're not making sure it doesn't regrow. So those are the kind of instances, kind of painting it on to stumps and other very specific small scale spot treatments there. I've had a lot of conversations with land managers over the last couple of years, actually picking their brains on how in the world to manage broom and other non-natives. This seems to be kind of a universal approach. And
if I can add, we
Yeah.
would use the agency having jurisdictions integrated pest management plan and not use any herbicides that aren't listed on that plan. And we can only use the herbicides that are listed in the Cal VTP.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And then Larry is saying that San Rafael Hill, he's seen no negative impacts from goat grazing and no increase in invasive plants, no degradation. So apparently very happy with those activities there. That's great. Regarding prescribed burning, that is definitely a possibility in future projects. We, obviously with a prescribed burn, you need to, and I'm speaking from experience, and maybe some of you on this call have the experience as well, and I know Mark sure does, but you need to go through and kind of prepare your burn unit before you can burn, or else your controlled burn will not remain controlled. So your crew might go in with, loppers, maybe a chainsaw. Certainly you're going to have a hand crew making sure that you're reducing the ladder fuels that could carry fire, surface fire up into the canopy. The activities that we're planning and as part of this shaded field break are really similar to those activities in terms of prepping a burn unit. And that we need to prep our landscapes before we can start burning. Prescribed burning will definitely be part of future projects. We're starting from the house out. We're doing home hardening, defensible space, evacuation routes, roadside vegetation management, evacuation planning, shaded field breaks adjacent to homes. And most homeowners are a little nervous about a drip torch right outside their back fence. So we're holding off on that at the moment. But future plans for sure. It's an ecological process that's really important. Anything else here? It's 8:02.
Yeah, it looks like Robin.
I think we can address the last question from Robin as far as carbon sequestration, Robin. And we're actually really excited about a biomass study that we're the MWPA, Marin RCD, Drawdown Marin, several others. I'm probably missing some agencies that are involved. A $500,000 grant that we received from the state to study the biomass processing. And so part of that is to do it in such a way that helps with carbon sequestration. And one of the things that you see on here is air curtain burning can be done in ways to create biochar, and that helps us to get the carbon sequestration back into the ground. Pile burning can be done in a way to help increase biochar. So definitely we are making sure that our vegetation treatments are not going against carbon sequestration, but it actually promotes. And then the thing that's been pounded in my head from Bruce Goins is that a healthy forest is good carbon management. So the healthier the forest is, the better it can sequester carbon.
Yeah, we have a lot of trees per acre, but those trees are smaller in diameter and sequestering far less carbon than they would have otherwise. And so if you reduce some of the competition around some of those trees, then they're going to grow bigger and sequester more carbon. And it's really kind of an order of magnitude or two in terms of how much carbon is sequestered. So, and if we make them more resilient to wildfire, then that carbon is going to remain on the landscape for longer. So it's a more dependable carbon sequestration scenario.
May I say something?
Mm-hmm.
I think the points that both of you just made are ones that I'd like you to make more loudly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for the suggestion.
Thank you.
Thanks. You know, we could add some content to our website around that, because there's some really interesting science around this, and they're really important points that what we're doing is contributing towards not only climate adaptation, but also climate mitigation and reducing carbon emissions. The amount of wildfire related carbon emissions in 2021 for worldwide are the equivalent of everything, all of the emissions for California times 5. So we're seeing a lot of emissions from forest fires. It's really quite alarming. And so the more we can do to make healthier forests and healthier landscapes, the better in terms of carbon emissions as well.
Say that loud.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
So I think the overall, all of the breakout rooms are actually going to be closing up probably momentarily. So we've really appreciated having everybody's attention tonight. And I know that I think I can speak for everybody here. It's really been wonderful, and we've really appreciated all the questions and all of the discussion that we've been able to have with everybody. So thank you.
May I say one other thing? I think that a lot of people were hoping to see zoomed in maps, so they had some idea where the edges of things were. And even if we had just seen one zoomed in one, it would helped, I think, communicate where exactly you were talking about. And I know those things are probably coming in the next month or two, as from what I overheard. But it just seemed that in the first breakout room I was in, there were a lot of people who really wanted to know that, and we actually didn't have much time for questions, so it didn't get there.
Thanks so much for that.
Yeah.
We've got kind of initial maps uploaded to the project page on our website, and we'll be updating those resources on that project page. So we'll duly noted, and we'll see if we can address that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just posted the link. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And they did get posted yesterday. Perhaps somebody.
Very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. If you want to receive email updates, make sure to put in the chat. Is this right, Caitlin, that they should contact? I'm looking for her name.
Yeah. Yes. So it was actually,
I couldn't find her name when you said to email her or to chat her.
Okay.
Well, maybe I think we'll talk, and maybe there's something we can put on the website to be able to be added to it.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah. Maybe sign up for updates.
The name was Kate Medlock.
Thank you.
Is she in there?
Well, I found her.
Okay, good.
It starts with a C. That's your trick. It starts with a C.
we'll probably just add something to the project page so that people can enter their email address for project updates for this.
We'll definitely add that. And the
Yeah.
recordings for the main session and the breakout rooms will also be on our
Great.
website.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you,
so
everybody.
much, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
You. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We're the last of the last. Take care. Good night. Thank you guys for the overtime. Appreciate it. Really do. Bye.
Take care, Larry.
Bye.
Yeah, have a good night, everyone.
Take
It was a
care.
great
Night.
meeting.
Let's see.
Like, I don't want to.